So this lecture actually incorporates both ancient Mesopotamia and Zoroastrianism. It's a little confusing because depending which syllabus you have, it might just list Zoroastrianism or it might list both. But some students get confused and just think that everything that I'm talking about in this lecture is Zoroastrianism, and that's just simply not the case. We're actually going to be talking about two different traditions. Well, one religious tradition, Zoroastrianism, and then another region, an ancient region, that gives birth to many of the ideas about gods and creation and ethics that we take for granted in many of our contemporary monotheistic traditions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as Zoroastrianism. So I'll try to do my best to parse these out and show you where, indicate where we depart from one and start talking about the second. So first we're going to talk about ancient Mesopotamia. So we're not talking about Zoroastrianism quite yet. Ancient Mesopotamia is a general region, but we can think essentially modern day Iraq. So this is a modern, relatively modern map of the Middle East. Mesopotamia is within this region of Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates River along the eastern portion of the Fertile Crescent. So the Fertile Crescent is a crescent shape area here where, like the name demonstrates, is very fertile due to, you know, the rivers and whatnot that feed this region of the world. So ancient Mesopotamia is going to be right here in this region, and we're going to look more particularly at a story that comes out of this Babylonian region of ancient Mesopotamia, or even more particularly down here in Uru or Uruk. So before we get there though, let's talk just a little bit in generality. So most traditions, most religious traditions at this time are highly polytheistic. If you remember from a previous lecture, polytheism is the belief in many gods, two or more gods technically, but think of civilizations that believe in a whole pantheon of gods, different gods reigning over different realms of the earth. What I want you to get across in this, or what I'm trying to get across in this slide here, is simply that the religious beliefs and practices change over time. So as we move through history, as we look back as far as 3000 BCE, and then progress into an era closer to the turn of the millennia, or zero, we see a shift in religiosity that reflects the status of the people at the time. So what do I mean by this? If we go back to 3000 BCE, keep in mind this is 5,000 years ago, 3000 BCE and prior to this period of time, in ancient Mesopotamia, they are polytheistic, but their gods mostly reflect the primarily agricultural nature of their civilization. So there is a god of rain, a god of sun, a god of disease, a god for the crops, so on and so forth. This should be no surprise to us, right? What is the most important thing to this community? Agriculture. This is what sustains life, so we look to the gods to reflect the necessary components that take part in this agricultural life. As the civilizations begin to develop, begin to acquire and amass surplus, we get a shift in the type of civilization that exists. Between 3000 and 2000 BCE, we get the rise of civilization, city walls, kings, political structures, social rules, so on and so forth. And then it should be no surprise to us, the gods that developed during this period of time, during the rise of these many civilizations, reflect the names and qualities of these rulers. Gods look more like parents. They look more like kings. They have power over individuals. They care about how you act, how you treat other people. There's certain moral judgment. As one would expect with our society looking this way, one projects this center of one's focus onto the gods themselves. Then between about 2600 BCE and 1000 BCE, really gods and kings become much less distinguishable. This is very similar to the medieval understanding of a divine right of kings, that kings have this certain right that is granted to them by the gods directly. So as we're going to see, we're going to look at this very well-known story that comes out of this region of the world right around this time, about 2600 to 2000 BCE. So between these two periods of time, we're going to just kind of cover the Epic of Gilgamesh, this ancient poem or piece of literature. We see that the gods very much reflect the concerns of society at the time. And I have this here not because we're going to go into any depth when it comes to ancient Mesopotamia. We're just basically going to talk about this one predominant, well-known story. But when we go into other traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of them, their understanding of nature, the cosmos, or if they include gods, the gods themselves reflect the concerns of the society at the time. And we'll get into much more detail with each of these traditions. So let's talk briefly about the Epic of Gilgamesh. My assumption would be that many of you are familiar with this story. Maybe you read it in high school. But if not, it's okay. We're not going to read the entire Epic of Gilgamesh. I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of the main story plot, and then we're going to talk about why it's significant for world religions. Why are we talking about this ancient poem that comes out of Mesopotamia in a world religions course? So, you should know it was written in ancient form of Sumerian, a language that is no longer spoken or written, but a language that we have been able to translate quite effectively. This is what ancient Sumerian looks like. This is actually a tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We didn't discover this until the mid to late 19th century, but we found many copies, and it has continued to be passed along orally, and they seem to match up quite well. Some tablets are missing. We've filled in the gaps here and there, but all in all, there's very little conflict over what we interpret the Epic of Gilgamesh to actually be saying. Here I have it dated around 2600 BCE. We're not exactly sure on that date. Again, it was an orally transmitted story, eventually written down, so we don't have fast and firm dates, but we're talking about this period of time generally, and this region of the world generally. So, what is the Epic of Gilgamesh about? It starts with the protagonist, who is this man named Gilgamesh. And at the time, he is the king of Uruk, and Uruk is one of these great civilizations in southern Mesopotamia, south of where Baghdad is today, right along in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where they kind of come down and almost meet in the southeastern portion of modern-day Iraq. Now, what's interesting about Gilgamesh, there's a lot that's interesting about Gilgamesh, but one very interesting fact that the story starts out with is it tells us that Gilgamesh is not an ordinary human being. He's actually part human and part god. If I remember correctly, he's a third human and 2/3 god. And he's not a nice man. He is powerful, and he is the ruler of this great civilization, but he is what I have written down here as a despotic ruler, someone who does not respect the dignity of his own people, takes the power, lets it go to his head, and treats them quite unkindly throughout his rule. The other interesting thing about him being part god and part human is that he's mortal, so he can die, and he will die, and we see him struggle existentially with this question of death throughout his life. But because he's part god, he's stronger than any other human being, he's good looking, he's larger than any other human being, so he's kind of a greater than human being figure, but also he is fundamentally human because he, like all other humans, will die. Immortality is reserved for the gods, the full gods. They can live forever and will live forever, but Gilgamesh is destined to die at some point in his life. Then enters this second character. He's probably the second most important character in this text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and his name is Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is interesting because he's sent down or created by the gods, and he's created in response to the people's pleas for justice. So you have Gilgamesh's people who are being treated poorly. They're in so many different ways. I'll actually attach a video here, and it kind of goes into a little more detail, but many of the women are taken by Gilgamesh and raped. Many of the men are killed by Gilgamesh or sentenced to death. He just doesn't seem to care about the dignity or well-being of his own people. So they finally reach out to the gods, the high gods, and they say, please do something. This Gilgamesh is intolerable. We cannot stand him being our ruler anymore. So the gods create this Enkidu. And Enkidu is supposed to be the counterpart to Gilgamesh. He's supposed to be that who can battle Gilgamesh. He is his adversary. He is the only one who could stand up to someone as great as Gilgamesh. However, as Gilgamesh kind of stands for what is the civilized human being, right? He's the head of a civilization. Enkidu is very savage. He's seen as an animal or a beast of some sort. So they're positioned here as enemies. They come together and they fight. And they fight day and night. And they finally see that they are each other's equal in a way. And neither can defeat the other. So in the end, this actually gives birth to a mutual respect. The gods are quite upset with this. The civilians, the people who Gilgamesh are ruling, are quite upset with this, because these two were Enkidu was supposed to come down and show Gilgamesh the wrongdoing of his ways and kind of fix him, if not defeat him completely. And they don't defeat each other, and they say, oh, look, we're worthy adversaries. So they engender this mutual respect and become the best of friends. Then enters Ishtar. Now, Ishtar is the daughter of the high god Anu. So you can see this name Anu here. Anu's the high god, the greatest of the gods that exist in this pantheistic society, this polytheistic society. And Ishtar is his daughter. And Ishtar is supposed to be beautiful. She is the goddess of sex and love. She is seducing. And she comes down and she expresses her interest in Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, remembers, this strong, strong man. He's part god, part human. He can defeat pretty much anyone except for Enkidu. And Gilgamesh, however, knows a lot about Ishtar. Stories are circulating about Ishtar, and they're very familiar with all of Ishtar's past relationships. This has become part of their folklore. Gilgamesh knows that any human being that has ever entered a relationship with Ishtar, when Ishtar's expressed sexual and romantic interest in these humans and they succumb to it, it always ends badly for them. It either ends in deep depression because she just does away with them when she's finished with them. Many of them have died. Many have gone crazy over wanting her more. So Gilgamesh knows that there's a very terrible track record. So when Ishtar expresses this interest in Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh essentially says, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not interested. And this takes a real toll on Ishtar's sense of ego. I mean, it hurts her ego in this sense. So she gets really upset. She goes to Daddy. She goes, Daddy, who is this high god Anu, she goes, Gilgamesh rejected me. And I need you to avenge me for this wrongdoing that Gilgamesh just engaged in. So what does Anu do? He creates another beast, not like Enkidu now, but a more animal-like beast, and it is the Bull of Heaven, who is sent down to attack both Gilgamesh and Enkidu. They actually kill the bull. They manage to defend themselves against the Bull of Heaven. They kill the bull, and the gods are quite upset with this. So as revenge for all of this, the gods strike Enkidu ill, and he dies. And Gilgamesh is aware of this. He knows that he doesn't just fall sick coincidentally. He knows that this came directly from the gods. So, now we're going to stop there for a second. We're going to go back in time, because the Epic of Gilgamesh at this point then recalls an ancient story that everyone in this region of Uruk, or ancient Mesopotamia, is very aware of. And that's the story of Utnapishtim. Now, Utnapishtim is an interesting character, and we're going to start seeing at this point why we are even reading, or why I'm even kind of telling you about the Epic of Gilgamesh. What we're going to see is much of what is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, many of the characters, many of the events, are also found in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible. So, the first familiar character is going to be this Utnapishtim. He is a much older character who existed much prior to Gilgamesh, and Utnapishtim had engaged in a covenant with the gods. A covenant is a type of agreement or a contract with the gods. And the gods at the time were quite upset with humanity. They looked at humanity and they said, there's not a single righteous person here, except for this Utnapishtim. He's a good and righteous man. So they approach Utnapishtim and they say, hey, we've got a deal for you. We would like to flood the entire earth. We want to kill everyone. We want to start over with humanity. So they say, we want to save you, but we're going to kill the rest of humanity, and we're going to leave you to procreate. Now, to many of you guys right now, you're probably thinking, wow, this sounds a lot like the story of Noah. And it is a lot like the story of Noah. We now know, we'll talk about this during Judaism and Christianity, that when the Hebrew Bible was being written between 800 and 200 BCE, they had a lot of access to this community. They were at one time actually banished to the area of Babylon where this story was widely disseminated. So there's no coincidence there. It's a direct borrowing from the early writers of the Bible from this epic of Gilgamesh. So the gods say, okay, we're going to flood the entire earth. We want to save you. Now, any guesses as to what they have Utnapishtim do to save himself? I'll give you a second to think about it. All right. Those of you who guessed build an ark, you are correct. They had Utnapishtim build a large ark. And then what did they tell Utnapishtim to do? They said, get a pair of every animal that is roaming the earth and bring it on to this ark. And then we're going to flood the earth, you guys will be safe, and then you will repopulate the earth. And in exchange for this, they said, we will give you immortality. So you will be the only human being who does not have to die, who doesn't have to experience death. You will live forever. So Utnapishtim says, great, sounds like a good deal. I'm going to listen to my gods. I'm going to build this ark. I'm going to collect a pair of each animal. The earth will be flooded, so on and so forth. And then once the floods subside, he repopulates the earth and is now immortal. So this happened long before Gilgamesh in this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh is now going to try to find Utnapishtim, right? He is going through this moral angst. He is having existential issues. He's really worried not only about his own death, he's not only still sad that he has to die and quite uncomfortable with this fact, but he's also grieving the loss of his best friend, Enkidu, who was just killed. So he says, I can't die. I am greater than that. I need to find immortality. So I need to go find the one guy who has immortality, who can live forever, who is a human being, and that is Utnapishtim. Remember, he's still alive. Even if the Utnapishtim flood story took place 1,000 years before Gilgamesh, he's still kicking it. He's still hanging around somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia. So Gilgamesh goes on this epic journey, right? Hence the name, the Epic of Gilgamesh, to find Utnapishtim. He finds Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim says, yeah, you can get immortality too. There's actually this secret that only I know. There is immortality in the form of a plant, a very rare plant, one that stands out and looks like no other plant that you've ever seen, that is at the bottom of the ocean. Now remember, the bottom of the ocean is not you or I could just dive down to the bottom of the ocean, but Gilgamesh is special, right? He can hold his breath longer than any human being, he can swim faster and deeper, he's stronger than any other human being. So Utnapishtim says, look, you might actually be able to do this. Here's kind of like a general map, but it's not going to be easy. So we continue. Gilgamesh goes out on this other epic journey, going through forests, defeating beasts, finding finally the area that he has to go to. He dives to the bottom of the depths of the ocean. He locates this plant. He finds it. He grasps it from the bottom of the ocean. He swims all the way back up, holding one long breath. He finally gets to the surface. He crawls to the shore. He walks into this beautiful, lush garden that's very similar to the Garden of Eden that we read in the Hebrew Bible. And he takes this plant and he falls asleep. So there's his real mistake, right? You find the plant of immortality, you should just eat the thing. Gilgamesh says, you know what, I'm exhausted. I just dove to the bottom of the ocean. I need to sleep. So he sits back, he puts the plant down next to him, and he falls asleep. Then a small creature comes by and snatches that plant from him, and he guesses as to what kind of small creature that might be. I'll give you a moment to think about it. For those of you who guessed a snake or a serpent, you are correct. Again, very much in line with the many stories we see in Genesis, a book that was written around the time when early Hebrews were exposed to the ancient Mesopotamian culture. So this snake comes by into this garden, it snatches that plant, it eats it, it sheds its skin, and then it leaves. So the shedding of the skin is representative of a rebirth or renewal of some sort, and it leaves. Gilgamesh wakes up, he looks to his side, he sees the snake's skin that had been shedded, and he says, I messed up. I now see the error in my way. So what do we make of this? I should finish the story. So he's now realizing he's not going to get immortality, and he goes back to his grand kingdom, his large walls that surround his wonderful kingdom and civilization. And he's dealing with the fact that he has to die, that he will not be finding immortality. And he looks at his kingdom and he says, oh, I see. If I'm going to die, then my immortality is not going to be in this literal immortality of the self, but rather it is going to be in the legacy that I leave behind. So he says, I must do two things. I must build even greater walls so that what I leave here will last. People will remember me. People will worship me for generations and millennia to come. But also, I must treat my people better. If I'm going to have a legacy, it needs to be a positive legacy. So in the end, he is a benevolent ruler, someone who helps his people and cares about their dignity and goodwill. So, what is the purpose of this story? What message or moral should we take from it? One, that the people of ancient Mesopotamia during this time are very clearly saying immortality is reserved for the gods. That your role, if you believe in the gods, if you are religious in this sense, your goal is not to achieve immortality. It is not to go to a place like heaven and exist in the same way that you exist now for the rest of your life. Rather, you must die in the end. You lose what you have here, but your goal is to be a better person. Your goal is to leave a good legacy. So it's this worldly immortality that we ought to care about, treat people better, leave a good, strong legacy. Also, the reason that we care about the story at all is there is a very specific Judeo-Christian legacy, and Islamic as well, that stems from this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we see things like a flood, we see a Garden of Eden, we see the Nephilim. There are actually pillars of light that come down in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I didn't cover in this portion here. And that's no coincidence, right? Something very different, though, the Christian response to this same set of problems is not, oh, you must deal with your immortality, you must accept the fact that you will die. You must deal with your mortality, that you must accept the fact that you're going to die. Rather, the Christian answer is often, not always, but a predominant and particularly American form of Christianity says there is immortality, right? You believe in the saving power of your Savior, Christ, then you will extend your life. Life everlasting will be granted to you in perhaps this place called heaven, which we'll talk about in much more detail during Christianity. We see other things, of course, as well that influence the literary style of the early Hebrew Bible, which becomes part of the fuller Christian Bible. And that they just offer different answers to the same set of problems. So we're going to keep coming back to this story, to ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to look at what periods of time did these early authors of the Bible become exposed to this literature and other theological positions that the ancient Mesopotamians held. Okay, now we're going to talk about Zoroastrianism. So everything that I have set up until this point, let me just check to make sure this is recording. We're looking good. is not about Zoroastrianism. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, the polytheistic societies that believe in many gods, that was all ancient Mesopotamia. It's a region that is close to where Zoroastrianism is born, but I was not speaking about Zoroastrianism. At this point forward, we're going to talk about a religious tradition, a specific religion called Zoroastrianism, but I don't want you to confuse the two because they're coming in the same lecture here. So, ancient Mesopotamia is in this region here. So Babylon is kind of the center of ancient Mesopotamia at the time, the largest, kind of grandest civilization and society. This is the region along the Euphrates River where the Epic of Gilgamesh is thought to have taken place, but we find the story throughout ancient Babylon. Zoroastrianism begins and thrives in the region of modern-day Iran, or what we sometimes just refer to as Persia as the general area. Different languages spoken, different religious tradition, different texts, so different traditions altogether, but they do come side by side. Zoroastrianism is born a little bit later than some of those stories and histories that we just talked about in ancient Mesopotamia. So, we are going to start discussing Zoroastrianism with a founder, a central figure. Now, not every tradition that we'll be talking about throughout this course will start with a founder. For example, Hinduism does not start with a single founder. Judaism does not start with a single founder. But Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, these are a little bit easier to kind of talk about a person's experience, who tends to be the founder or central religious figure, and how a religion develops thereafter. That figure in Zoroastrianism is a guy named Zarathustra. Sometimes he's also referred to as Zoroaster, if you're looking at many of the early Greek translations where we get a lot of our information on Zoroastrianism. Now, when did Zoroaster or Zarathustra exist? We don't really know, is the easy answer. One of the leading scholars in Zoroastrianism, her name is Mary Boyce, and she's done a lot of research into this, and she says, yeah, some people say as early as 1800 BCE because there's such influence that comes from this tradition that goes to influence early Hebrew writers. Some say as late as 600 BCE, they kind of reverse the influence in order, but she determines that it's most likely somewhere between 1700 and 1500 BCE, and I can give you that citation and that research if you want to do any kind of further reading into dating this tradition of Zoroastrianism. Now, today, there are over 200,000 Zoroastrians in the world. Most of them live in the northwestern region of India. They're called Parsis, is how they refer to themselves at least. However, we have Zoroastrians in Southern California. There's actually a thriving Zoroastrian community in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the world as well. In rural parts of eastern Iran, where the religion was born, we still have some Zoroastrians hanging out doing their thing. So I don't want you to think that Zoroastrianism is a dead religion. It is still a very much alive religion, though it is very, very small. In that introductory lecture when I was talking about each of the traditions that we'll be discussing during this course, I mentioned that 200,000 followers is far less than a fraction of 1% of the world's population. So it's very likely that you don't know any Zoroastrians. I have the privilege of knowing a handful, but you're probably not going to be working with them side by side with any regularity, at least. Though they're out there, and it's worth understanding their tradition, not just for how they've influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it's worth understanding their tradition for the tradition that is alive and well today, right? These are people who still practice this tradition, so let's seek to understand it as much as we can. So, it starts as Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, who at age 30 has this great vision, and this vision continues for up to 10 years. We're going to see that many of the visions that these prophets or founders have are not just one single vision that they then kind of try to interpret or expound upon for the rest of their life, but rather these visions continue. The Prophet Muhammad, for example, has his first vision or experience with the angel Gabriel in 610 CE, and they last for the next 22 years until the day that he dies. So this is a common theme that we see in monotheistic traditions. that involves some kind of prophet, that these visions continue for a prolapsed period of time. He has this vision of how the world should work and who is the one true God. And he's trying to convince his king at the time that he's had this vision and that there's a new way in which one should see the world and certain things that go along with it. So certain rituals you must engage in, certain practices, certain expectations that this new way of seeing the world entails. And the king doesn't believe him and says, "Off with you, you sound crazy." And he says, "Okay, here, I'll prove it to you." And he performs a miracle of some sort. If my memory serves me correctly, he brings back the king's favorite horse who has died. He brings him back to life, and the king is convinced and says, "Okay, you have these powers. This must be coming from something greater than both of us." And he converts, and Zoroastrianism begins as a tradition. And then he dies at age 77. So Zarathustra himself is nothing more than a human being. He's not a god himself. Zoroastrians do not worship Zoroaster. They do not worship Zarathustra, but they follow his guidance. They follow his wisdom that he preached and then was eventually written down. So what is this revelation that he has? Basically, he was engaging in what was a purity ritual for a spring festival at the time, where they immerse themselves in water, and Zarathustra was going into the water. He was purifying himself, and as he emerged out of the water, he saw this great, shiny, bright light. So he has this vision. He's confronted with this great light that calls itself good purpose or good thought. And this great, shiny, bright light leads him to Ahura Mazda. And I need you to know this name. Ahura Mazda is the one true God. So I mentioned earlier in a previous lecture that Zoroastrianism is one of the earliest, perhaps the oldest, monotheistic tradition. Definitely the oldest monotheistic tradition that survives till today. But they believe in one God, right? Monotheism, the belief in one God. That one God is Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is called many things, but most commonly is called the Lord of Wisdom. And Zarathustra says, for those of you who follow the one true God and his ways, his teachings, you will be rewarded with immortality. So, in contrast to the Epic of Gilgamesh, we now see a tradition that is still struggling with these existential questions of what's going to happen after I die, what is the purpose of life, why are we here, where are we going, so on and so forth. Zarathustra says, aha, we can receive immortality if you follow the will of the one true God, Ahura Mazda, or Lord of Wisdom. Just a little side note here on the migration. We're going to talk about Zoroastrianism's influence in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but we're also going to talk about its influence in Hinduism, just quite briefly. And here's the most, I guess, reputable theory that exists today, is there were these hunters and gatherers that lived throughout Europe and Central Asia, and a group of them descended down into this region here. This is kind of modern-day Turkey over here. This is Iran. These are kind of some of the old Russian states that have been divvied up on a modern map. This is the group that we hypothetically believe existed, and we think at this point they split into two different directions. Over here, they split into what is modern-day Iran. Over here, they split into what is modern-day India. And why we think this is they have similar rooted language that we don't find anywhere else. Also, we interestingly find in Zoroastrianism, the society that develops in this region of the world, the exact same god that we find in this ancient Indic or Vedic religion, the god Mithra. So it's beyond the possibility of coincidence. There had to be some kind of direct relationship or borrowing. So we think that these two traditions spawn from one more ancient community of people, and we can see this migration route is between the 35th and 25th century BCE, so between 3500 and 2500 BCE. That fits right in with our timeline. Okay, so who is Ahura Mazda? And what is this thing called Angra Mainyu, which I haven't mentioned yet? We already learned Ahura Mazda is the one true God, the one uncreated God. I want you to know this. Ahura means light, Mazda means wisdom. We see a lot of similarities, as I've said, between Zoroastrianism and Jewish, Christian, and Islamic texts. Some we see are in the creation myths, the way in which the world was created in Zoroastrianism, in their ancient sacred texts, which we'll talk about in a second here, is very similar to the creation myth in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. We see that the world and universe was created in 7 stages by the one uncreated God, the one God that was not created by anything else, that pre-exists existence itself. And this one God is supposed to embody all that is good and righteous and just in the world. So it embodies good purpose, good thought, good action. It is responsible for the justice we see in the world, the order we see in the world, and righteousness. Some of this terminology is going to sound very familiar to you if you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish. This is borrowed from, I think, directly from Zoroastrianism. Also, as I've mentioned, it is a monotheistic tradition. There is one God. However, it's morally dualistic. Dualism meaning two. There are two opposing sides, two features when it comes to morality or ethics. So what is morality or ethics? Essentially, we're asking the question in ethics, what is right? How should you act in the world? What is expected of you as a follower of this tradition? So it's monotheistic. There's only one God. There's not a God and a devil. There's not a God and an anti-God. Nothing of that sort. One God and one God only. However, you can do good or you can do bad. You can be on the side of righteousness or the side of injustice. You can be on the side of order or the side of chaos. So everything is kind of seen in these two opposite forms. There's good and bad, right, justice, injustice, so on and so forth. Okay. Then what is Angra Mainyu? I should say, again, I'll say this 100 times, Angra Mainyu is not the devil. It is not an evil spirit. It is not anything that exists in the world in a tangible form. Angra Mainyu is just supposed to be that which draws us away from the one true God. It's that which draws us away from light. So it is darkness. If Ahura Mazda stands for justice, Angra Mainyu is injustice. It is the ego. It is selfishness, not selflessness. It represents darkness, destruction, chaos, deception. And Zoroastrianism sets forth this large cosmic struggle. So we as human beings are struggling. We are not morally perfect, right? We every day throughout our lives have to make decisions. Do we do what we know is good and right, or do we do what is unjust and wrong and chaotic and deceptive or destructive? And they say, Zoroastrians, that there are these two forces that are battling against each other. And if you're on the side of what is good and right and just, we will overcome what is injustice, destruction, chaos, and deception. So in the battle, light, the side of wisdom, will win. I have here, it's not like the yin and yang. If anyone knows the yin and yang symbol, you can stop this podcast or this lecture and Google it really quickly if you're not familiar with it. We have these two intersecting colors, right? We have darkness and light as this moral dualism is setting up. But in the yin and yang structure, both are necessary to sustain the other. So light is only possible because of darkness. Good is only possible because of bad. And within the light there is darkness, and within darkness there is light. That is not the way Zoroastrianism is set up. It is opposing forces, not complementary forces, but opposing forces where one will destroy the other. Then there are these things called devas. Devas are a little more complicated and presented in various ways, but for our purposes in this class, we'll just think of them as kind of the manifestation of Angra Mainyu. So how do we know that there is evil or an opposing force that exists in the world? We have things like bad thoughts. We are greedy. We have malintent. We focus on the self and not others. these are these forces that are within us that tempt us, at the very least, to do bad, or sometimes cause us to do bad. So the goal, be on this side, not on this side. Okay. Briefly, just for a minute here, I'm just going to mention what the Zoroastrian scriptures are. This is the, of course, sacred text of Zoroastrianism, which you can still find today. You can go to a specialty bookstore and find these ancient scriptures, which are known as the Avesta. Now, the Avesta is kind of the full collection of all of the sacred scriptures in Zoroastrianism. It contains two sections, is probably the best way to put it, the Yasna and the Gathas. But the Avesta in total is the equivalent of, say, the Bible. Now, most people will look actually to the Gathas. It's the most popular aspect of these ancient scriptures, and we'll talk about why in just a second here. The Yasna contains more of the liturgical texts. By liturgical, I mean the texts that direct you in how to carry out certain rituals. So if you're a Zoroastrian priest, for example, you would look to this portion to explain to you how you should go about sacrificing certain grains or products to the one true God. Now, the Gathas are the most popular. These contain the hymns, the songs, the poems. They're devotional in nature, and they're looking at and focused on the nature of Ahura Mazda. What is God actually like? What does God want from us? What does God demand from us? You're going to learn that in the Gathas. So as a general follower of Zoroastrianism, if you are a Zoroastrian, you're going to look more to the Gathas. This has more of your instruction. It also has most of the teachings of Zoroastrianism, which are attributed to Zoroaster himself. By attributed, I mean they're thought to have been written by Zoroaster or Zarathustra. So let's listen to what it sounds like to recite the Gathas, because it's not, if you're a Christian, for example, and you go to church and you hear someone reciting from the Bible, they're most likely reading directly from text, and then they talk about it. That's not the way that the Gathas are recited, and we're going to come to see that's not the way that the Quran is recited in Islam. It's not the way that the Hebrew scriptures are recited in Judaism. They're much more musical in their intonation. They're much more performed than they are just read. So let's go ahead and listen to this together, just for a minute or so.
Framrot Ha. This Ha is to be recited on the first 5 days of the Fravardegan. That is, from Roj Astad to Roj Anneran of Maha Aspandad.
You can see here this is an actual Zoroastrian ritual, a fire ritual that's taking place, where many things like fruit, grain, bread, milk are offered to the fire. They're sacrificed to the fire for the one true God, Ahura Mazda. The men are dressed in all white as a sign of purity, and then they have these coverings over their mouths so as to block any impurities from entering the ritual itself. So let's go ahead and just watch this for, well, it's actually just an audio recording with this picture in the background.
Ashem vahu vaishtemasti Ushtasti ushta ahamai Yat ashai vahishtai Ashem Paname yazdan aura mazda kodai Awazuni gorze kore awazayaud Ardau fravash beresaud Azama gunao patet pashemano Azarvastin dushmatta.
So you get a sense of how one would actually listen to the ancient Avesta text being read. Okay, let's go back. Pardon me. Okay, here we are. I should also say, I have written here Avestin. Avestin is the language. It's an ancient language that's no longer spoken outside the world of Zoroastrianism. But it's where the root Avesta comes from. So the ancient language is called Avestin. The text, the sacred scriptures, are called the Avesta. Okay. Now I want to talk about fire just quickly, because fire is central to Zoroastrian practice and history. But there's a couple misconceptions that we should clear up about the relationship to fire. First is fire symbolizes Ahura Mazda. So when you see a fire in a Zoroastrian service, they're not worshiping the fire. This is a stereotype that they constantly have to correct. They're not sitting there bowing down to something that they can't understand like fire. It's much more mature than that. Fire is this fascinating element that covers everything. It can reduce all other material to its kind of quintessential base elements, just like God has the power to kind of destroy but also give birth to. So when a forest fire occurs, yes, it destroys, but it gives birth to new life in that process. As you saw in that picture, the Zoroastrian priests will cover their face so as to not enter their own impurities into the pure fire, but they might offer things like milk, bread, grains, the things that God has provided for us, right? This is what sustains life, so we will offer some of it back to you as a demonstration of our appreciation for it. So it's like I said, an agent of purity. Water and fire are the two purest elements. Remember, Zarathustra has the revelation when he comes out of the water. He's in a state of purity himself. Now he is okay to see God, only in the state of extreme purity. Fire is the other element of purity. Now, there are fire temple rituals that take place in Zoroastrian communities every week. I had the privilege of actually going to one a year or two ago, about 2 years ago, and it was incredible, and it's something that each and every one of you could do. So if you're ever in the Los Angeles area and would like me to put you in contact with the Zoroastrian priest in this region, I think it's in like the Rosemead area or Westminster area of Los Angeles, so a little bit further east of Los Angeles. I'm happy to do that. I'm going to show you a little video here of a fire temple ritual. This is not one that I attended. I did not have the foresight to actually film it while I was there. I just experienced it, but it was very much like this one, so you can we'll watch this together for a minute.
We don't have unlimited, but we do
Well,
have a 20 gig plan
after
for
this
$120
5-second,
a month.
That is not a good deal.
Here we go. Okay.
Welcome back to the religions of the ancient
Nope,
Mediterranean
sorry
podcast.
guys, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
There we go. Note you can hear him reciting from the Gathas as he offers the sacrifice to the fire. Also note this is obviously a college classroom that is observing this fire ritual here. Notice that everyone has their head covered, right? It could just be a baseball cap, it could be a scarf, something kind of like a hijab. In Islam, it could be your hood, but it's just a sign of respect. Note the priest also has a much more traditional head covering, but in many of the religious traditions that still have services, they'll require some kind of head covering. It's not just a Muslim thing, it's not just a Jewish thing, but it exists in Christianity, exists in Zoroastrianism, as well as in other traditions as well. So let's listen to it just a little bit more so we can kind of take it in. Okay. I just want to kind of bring it to life as much as possible so you're not just reading text and actually kind of seeing how these beliefs are put into practice. So just have a couple more slides here, 1 or 2 more slides. The Zoroastrians have a very, let me just make sure we're still recording. Sorry, I know I'm going to keep doing this to you guys. Okay, we're good still. The Zoroastrians have a very fascinating and somewhat, what we think from the outside or Western perspective, peculiar or even perturbing way about addressing death and entering that next realm of living, which they refer to as immortality. And they revolve around these things called the Tower of Silence, or the traditional Middle Persian term is called a dakma, which is still used today in many Zoroastrian societies. Dakma means to bury, but it's also referring to this Tower of Silence, this kind of reservoir that is built high up on the mountains in mostly eastern Iran or northwestern India. So, what happens is when you die, your corpse, your body, is taken up to the top of this tower, and it is left exposed to the elements. While it's exposed to the elements, vultures, this is the intention, right? This is what they're wanting to happen. Vultures will come and eat away the flesh that remains in your body, because your flesh is seen as impure. It is part of this world. It is not fit to enter the world of Ahura Mazda. Once that process is complete, your bones are then collected. They're cleaned in a very kind of traditional ritualistic manner, and then they're set back up into this Tower of Silence, or this dakma. And then the idea is the sun's rays will beat down on your clean, purified bones, which will create a path for your soul, something within you, an aspect of you that is not attached to the material world, to travel to this place called paradise. So if you see here in the this picture, this is from the inside of one of these dakmas. You can see the vultures kind of ominously hanging out here on the perimeter. And then if you see on this left-hand picture, there's kind of a deeper reservoir. That's what we're looking into here. You can see steps kind of lead down there, where the cleaned and washed bones will be left so the sun's rays can carry your soul to the afterlife. Now, the very last slide I have on Zoroastrianism. This picture here is not from Zoroastrianism. I actually think it's from a video game based on the Lord of the Rings, but it kind of gets the point that I'm trying to get across. Note that there's this bridge that is crossing these pits of fire, and we're going to talk about this bridge in just a second. It's not this actual bridge, but I have some creative, artistic license here with these slides. Okay. So there's this notion in Zoroastrianism, which most of us take for granted in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which states that humans have free will. What do I mean by free will? We have the ability to choose how we act, in what manner we act, and that there are certain consequences attached to these actions. So you have the choice as a Zoroastrian. You can follow the path of Ahura Mazda, or you can follow the path of Anger Mainyu, the kind of tendency to do injustice, to be greedy, to engage in malintent, and so on and so forth. Each of us has this moral struggle. We feel it in our lives every day. To be good, this is written in the Avesta, in the sacred scriptures, is to be like Ahura Mazda. It is to be like God, to seek justice, plant corn, care for the cattle, have compassion for the weak, give charity to the poor, and to promote education. So this is the ethical code which is set up for Zoroastrianism. Once you live your life, you've done, I'm sure, lots of good things, lots of bad things, hopefully more good than bad. You are then commanded, your soul is commanded to cross the Chinvat Bridge. So this bridge here in the background is what my artistic representation is for this bridge. The followers of Anger Mainyu, the kind of side of evil forces or greedy forces that exist here, if you just follow your own kind of sense of justice and not the justice set forth by Ahura Mazda, then that bridge is going to appear to you like a knife's edge. So incredibly thin and sharp that it will be impassable. You will not be able to cross this bridge, and you will then fall into what the Vesta describes as the pits. And your afterlife, so once you've fallen into these pits, your afterlife will consist of punishment and torment. Quite familiar to some of our theologies, especially if you're a Catholic. Maybe you were taught something about a place called hell. There's a lot of speculation that this concept of hell comes from these early depictions in Zoroastrianism, right? Pits of fire with punishment and torment. We're also going to talk about the concept of hell within Christianity that goes in a different direction from this kind of literal burning in fire. The followers of Ahura Mazda, those who followed the one uncreated God, the Lord of light and wisdom, this bridge that your soul will be faced toward will be a wide path that will lead to eternal paradise, or what the Avesta describes as the pleasant courts of God. They're described very much in terms of lush, plentiful fruit, water, so on and so forth, much like the Garden of Eden is described in the book of Genesis. In the very end, if enough of us do what is good and right and just in the world, that side of light, justice, good, will defeat the side of evil, darkness, and chaos. So in the end, everyone will enjoy the courts of God, the pleasant courts of God, or eternal paradise. We all take part in it. In the end, all souls, those who are even in the pits, will be purified, and the whole world will be transformed into a much greater sense of purity and peace and justice.